June 15, 1944, Normandy, France. The morning mist hung low over the hedgerows like ghostly fingers, and Sergeant Curtis Culin Jr. could taste metal in the air. Not from the tanks, from blood and burning steel. Another Sherman lay smoking in the field ahead, its crew scattered around it like broken dolls, that made 12 tanks in 3 days, all destroyed trying to break through these damn hedgerows. Rhino tanks, the Germans called them mockingly. Because American Shermans charged straight into the ancient earthen walls like mindless beasts, only to expose their vulnerable bellies to hidden Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns. Every hedgerow was a death trap. Every field crossing was a graveyard. But Culin wasn't looking at the burning Sherman with despair. He was studying it with the cold precision of a mechanic who'd spent his life solving problems other people called impossible. Back home in Cranford, New Jersey, he'd been just another guy fixing cars and farm equipment. Here in Normandy, he was watching the Allied advance grind to a bloody halt because nobody understood a simple truth. You don't fight geography, you engineer around it. The hedgerows of Normandy weren't just farmers' boundaries, they were medieval fortifications, some over 1,000 years old. Thick earthen banks topped with centuries of root growth, stone foundations, and tangled vegetation that could stop a 30-ton Sherman tank as effectively as a concrete wall. The Bocage countryside was a natural maze designed to funnel attackers into killing zones. General Omar Bradley called it the damnedest country I've ever seen. What he didn't say publicly was that the hedgerows were turning D-Day's success into a strategic nightmare. The Allies had successfully landed on the beaches, but now they were trapped in a green hell of ancient agriculture and modern weaponry. For every 100 yards gained, American forces paid in blood. Tank crews knew that approaching a hedgerow meant climbing over it, exposing the Sherman's thin belly armor to German weapons that could punch through it like paper. Infantry advancing without tank support got slaughtered by machine gun nests hidden in the dense vegetation. Something had to change, and Curtis Culin, a 29-year-old mechanic from New Jersey, was about to prove that sometimes the craziest ideas are the only ones crazy enough to work. The problem wasn't just tactical, it was mathematical. Every approach the Allied commanders tried led to the same brutal equation. Hedgerows plus German defenders equaled dead Americans. Standard doctrine called for tanks to climb over the hedgerows, but physics made this suicidal. As a Sherman's front end rose up the earthen bank, its belly became exposed at a perfect 90-degree angle to hidden German positions. Panzerfaust rockets and anti-tank guns could penetrate the Sherman's thin underside armor from 50 yards away. Tank crews called it getting belly shot, and it was almost always fatal. Infantry assaults without tank support fared even worse. German machine gunners had spent weeks positioning themselves in the dense vegetation, creating interlocking fields of fire. MG-42s could cut down entire squads in seconds. The Bocage amplified every defensive advantage while negating Allied superiority in numbers and air support. The engineers tried blasting gaps with explosives, but the ancient root systems and stone foundations absorbed tremendous punishment. Even successful breaches took hours to create and telegraphed American intentions to every German defender within miles. By the time a gap was blown, it was heavily defended and often mined. Bulldozers attempted to push through the hedgerows, but the massive earthen barriers required multiple passes, and the slow-moving dozers were sitting ducks for German anti-tank weapons. 3 bulldozers were destroyed in a single morning, attempting to breach just one hedgerow near Saint-Vith. Some tank commanders tried using high-explosive shells to blast openings, but the hedgerows were too thick and too well-rooted. A single Sherman carried only 90 rounds, and expending half the ammunition to maybe create a passable gap left the tank vulnerable in any subsequent firefight. The most desperate attempt involved mounting flamethrowers on Shermans to burn through the vegetation. The idea seemed logical: clear the green cover and eliminate German hiding spots. But the flamethrowers had limited range, required the tanks to get dangerously close, and the burning vegetation often created smoke screens that helped German defenders more than American attackers. After 2 weeks of grinding warfare, the 2nd Armored Division had advanced exactly 4 miles from the beaches. Casualties were mounting faster than replacements could arrive. German propaganda broadcasts mocked the invincible Allied war machine being stopped by farmers' hedges. General Bradley confided to his staff that unless something changed dramatically, the Normandy breakout could take 6 months instead of 6 weeks. 6 months of this slaughter would bleed the Allied armies white and potentially give Germany time to deploy new wonder weapons or negotiate a separate peace with Stalin. But nobody in command had asked the mechanics what they thought. And Curtis Culin was about to prove that sometimes the best military minds miss the simplest solutions. Curtis Culin Jr. wasn't supposed to be in France. At 29, he was older than most soldiers, married with a young daughter back home, and possessed skills that should have kept him stateside maintaining equipment. But Culin had volunteered for combat duty because he believed his mechanical expertise could make a difference where it mattered most. Growing up in Cranford, New Jersey, Culin had learned to see problems differently than most people. His father owned a small garage, and Curtis had spent his childhood watching impossible repairs become routine through creative thinking and stubborn persistence. A seized engine wasn't broken, it just needed the right approach. A bent frame wasn't hopeless, it required understanding how metal behaved under stress. When other kids played with toys, Culin took them apart to understand how they worked. When farm equipment broke down during harvest season, local farmers called the Culin garage because Curtis could fix anything, even when replacement parts weren't available. He'd fabricate solutions from scrap metal, modify components to serve new purposes, and somehow make broken machines work better than they had originally. His reputation for unconventional problem-solving had followed him into the army. During training at Fort Knox, Culin had impressed his instructors by jury-rigging a field repair for a Sherman transmission using parts from a destroyed half-track. The fix wasn't in any manual, but it worked perfectly and saved weeks of waiting for proper replacement parts. Now, watching American tanks burn in Norman hedgerows, Culin's mechanical mind was analyzing the problem from angles his commanding officers couldn't see. The issue wasn't German firepower or Allied tactics, it was simple physics. Tanks climbing over barriers exposed vulnerable angles. The solution was equally simple: don't climb over the barriers, go through them. On June 18th, Culin approached Captain James Morrison with his idea. Morrison was a good officer, but like most tankers, he thought in terms of existing doctrine and established procedures. "Sir, I think I know how to get through the hedgerows without exposing the belly armor," Culin began. Pulling out a rough sketch he'd drawn on the back of a ration box, Captain Morrison barely glanced at the drawing. "Sergeant, we've got the best military engineers in the world working on this problem. If there was a simple solution, don't you think they'd have found it by now?" "With respect, sir, engineers think like engineers, mechanics think like mechanics. Different problems need different kinds of thinking." Morrison's patience was wearing thin. The hedgerow problem had cost him half his tank crews in 2 weeks, and he didn't have time for amateur theorizing. "Culin, your job is to keep our tanks running, not redesign them. Leave the tactical innovation to the people trained for it." "Oi, but sir, if you just look at the concept." "That's enough, Sergeant. I've got a company of tanks to run and a war to fight. Focus on maintenance and leave strategy to your superiors." Culin saluted and walked away. But he wasn't discouraged. In his experience, the best solutions always seemed crazy to people who couldn't see past conventional thinking. Back at the garage in Cranford, he'd solved dozens of impossible problems that experts had declared unfixable. This was just another broken machine, and Curtis Culin had never met a machine he couldn't fix. That night, While other soldiers wrote letters home or cleaned weapons, Curtis Culin sat in a bomb crater with a flashlight, sketching designs on any scrap of paper he could find. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of climbing over hedgerows, tanks would cut through them at ground level using steel prongs welded to the front armor. The physics made perfect sense to Culin's mechanical mind. Hedgerows were strongest at the top, where centuries of growth had created thick tangles of roots and vegetation. But at the base, where the earthen banks met the ground, they were vulnerable. Steel teeth driven by 30 tons of Sherman tank could rip through dirt and roots like a giant plow. More importantly, a tank pushing through at ground level would never expose its belly armor. The frontal armor would face German anti-tank weapons at all times, and Sherman frontal armor could deflect most German weapons except the heaviest guns. It was a question of geometry, not firepower. Culin's design called for 4 steel prongs, each about 4 feet long, welded to the front of a Sherman tank at precisely calculated angles. The prongs needed to be low enough to bite into the base of hedgerows, angled correctly to prevent the tank from getting stuck, and strong enough to withstand enormous stress without breaking. The raw materials were readily available. The Normandy beaches were littered with German defensive obstacles called Czech hedgehogs, welded steel beams designed to stop landing craft and tanks. The Germans had positioned thousands of them during their Atlantic Wall construction, but the D-Day landings had largely bypassed these obstacles. Now they sat abandoned on the beaches, high-quality steel waiting to be repurposed. But Culin knew the technical challenges were significant. Welding modifications to tank armor in a combat zone was dangerous and potentially damaging to the vehicle's structural integrity. The angle of the prongs had to be perfect. Too steep and they'd dig into the ground, too shallow and they wouldn't penetrate the hedgerow base effectively. Weight distribution was another concern. Adding steel prongs would shift the Sherman center of gravity forward, potentially affecting its stability and maneuverability. The welds themselves had to be perfect. Combat stress would test every joint to its breaking point. Working by flashlight in his crater, Culin calculated angles, estimated stress loads, and refined his design through multiple iterations. He sketched cross-sections showing how the prongs would interact with different types of hedgerow. He drew detailed welding diagrams indicating where reinforcing plates would be needed. By dawn, Culin had a complete engineering plan, but he also understood military reality. Getting permission to modify tanks in a combat zone would require convincing officers who thought his idea was crazy. He needed a demonstration that would prove the concept worked before anyone would authorize testing it on actual Sherman tanks. The solution came to him as he watched a bulldozer struggling to push through a hedgerow near the motor pool. The dozer was fighting the hedgerow's strength instead of exploiting its weakness. Culin realized he needed to build a small-scale model first, something he could demonstrate without risking valuable equipment or drawing unwanted attention from skeptical superiors. Using a discarded ammunition crate and pieces of scrap metal from damaged vehicles, Culin built a scale model of his hedge-cutting device. The miniature tank was crude but functional. A wooden box with steel prongs attached at the calculated angles. For testing, he found a section of hedgerow that had been partially damaged by artillery but was still intact enough to represent the real obstacle. The first test was a disaster. The wooden model disintegrated on impact, the prongs bent at impossible angles, and Culin learned his first hard lesson about the difference between theory and reality. The forces involved in penetrating centuries-old root systems were far greater than his initial calculations had suggested. But failure taught him valuable lesson. The prongs needed to be thicker and positioned differently. The attachment points required massive reinforcement. Most importantly, the cutting action had to be combined with lifting. The prongs needed to dig in and then lever upward, using the tank's weight to rip through the hedgerow rather than simply pushing against it. Culin rebuilt his model with heavier materials salvaged from destroyed equipment. This time he incorporated lessons learned from watching bulldozers work. The prongs were repositioned at a steeper angle, designed to bite deeper into the hedgerow base before beginning the lifting action. The second test was more promising, but revealed new problems. The model cut partway through a small section of hedgerow before the improvised materials failed, but the concept worked. Steel prongs could indeed penetrate and tear through the ancient earthen barriers. The challenge was engineering them to survive the enormous stresses involved. Word of Culin's experiments began spreading among the mechanics and tank crews. Some were intrigued by the possibility of a solution to the hedgerow problem. Others thought he was wasting time on fantasy engineering while real tanks were burning in the fields. Sergeant Mike Dunnigan, Culin's closest friend in the unit, watched one of the tests and shook his head. "Curtis, you're trying to solve problems that generals and engineers have been working on for weeks. Don't you think if this was possible, somebody smarter than us would have figured it out already?" "Maybe," Culin replied, examining the bent metal from his latest failure. "Or maybe everybody smarter than us is thinking too hard about the problem. Sometimes the simplest solution looks too crazy to work." The third test nearly ended the project permanently. Culin had built a more robust model using steel components salvaged from a destroyed German vehicle, but when he tried to test it on a particularly thick section of hedgerow, the entire contraption caught on the roots and flipped over, nearly injuring Private Eddie Kowalski, who was helping with the experiment. "Oh, that's it," Kowalski declared, brushing dirt off his uniform. "This thing is going to kill somebody before it kills any Germans. Count me out." But Culin wasn't ready to quit. Each failure taught him something new about the physics involved. The hedgerows weren't uniform. They had weak points where drainage or animal activity had compromised the root structure. The prongs needed to be designed to find and exploit these vulnerabilities rather than attacking the hedgerow's strongest points. Late one evening, as Culin worked alone on his fourth iteration of the design, Captain Morrison approached the makeshift workshop. The captain had been watching the experiments from a distance, initially with amusement, then with growing curiosity. "Sergeant, you've been at this for a week now. Are you any closer to something that might actually work?" Culin looked up from his welding, sweat stinging his eyes. "Sir, I'm learning that the problem is harder than I thought, but I'm also learning it's not impossible. Give me a few more days." Morrison studied the latest model, more sophisticated than the previous attempts, with reinforced attachment points and prongs positioned at carefully calculated angles. "Well, what would you need to build a full-size version?" Captain Morrison's question set off a chain reaction that Curtis Culin hadn't anticipated. Word of the crazy mechanic's hedgerow cutter reached Major Jack Williams at division headquarters, and Williams wasn't pleased. He summoned Morrison and Culin to his command post the next morning, and the meeting didn't go well. "Captain Morrison, I understand one of your sergeants has been conducting unauthorized modifications to military equipment," Major Williams began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd climbed ranks through strict adherence to regulations. "Is this correct?" "Sir, Sergeant Culin has been working on a potential solution to the hedgerow problem. His experiments have been conducted during off-duty hours using salvaged materials." Williams turned his attention to Culin, studying him like an unpleasant specimen. "Sergeant, I've read reports of your activities, building unauthorized devices, conducting unsupervised tests, potentially damaging valuable equipment. Are you aware that field modifications to armored vehicles require approval from Army Ordnance?" "No, sir. I was not aware of that specific regulation," Culin replied honestly. "Furthermore, tactical innovations are developed by qualified personnel at appropriate facilities, not by mechanics in bomb craters. We have entire departments of engineers working on breakthrough technologies. What makes you think you can solve problems they cannot?" The question hung in the air like smoke from burning tanks. Culin understood he was being challenged not just on his specific idea, but on his right to think beyond his assigned role. In the Army's hierarchy, mechanics fixed things. Officers made decisions, and sergeant mechanics definitely didn't redesign equipment. Sir, with respect, I've been watching tanks burn for 2 weeks. Maybe fresh eyes can see something that established procedures haven't noticed. William's face darkened. Sergeant, established procedures exist because they're developed by people with education, training,
and authorized. This isn't a garage in New Jersey where you can weld random pieces of metal and hope for the Major, if I could just show you Sergeant Cullin's. Captain, this discussion is over. Sergeant Culin will cease all unauthorized experimentation immediately. Any further violations will result in disciplinary action. Is that understood? Yes, sir.
But the institutional resistance went deeper than one major's disapproval. That afternoon, Colonel Robert Sykes from Army Ordnance arrived unannounced at the motor pool. Sykes had heard rumors about field modifications and wanted to ensure proper protocols were being followed. Gentlemen, I understand there's been some creative thinking regarding hedgerow tactics, Sykes announced to the assembled mechanics. Let me be clear about Army policy. Equipment modifications require extensive testing, engineering approval, and authorization from proper channels. Individual initiatives, however well-intentioned, can compromise safety and effectiveness. Sykes examined Culin's workshop area and confiscated the latest prototype. So these amateur contraptions could weaken tank armor, interfere with normal operations, or fail catastrophically in combat. We can't have soldiers risking their lives on untested equipment. After Sykes departed, several mechanics approached Culin privately. Some offered encouragement, but others expressed concern about association with an operation that had drawn negative attention from senior officers. Curtis, maybe you should let this go, suggested Sergeant Tom Harrison. You're making enemies above your pay grade. Is it worth risking your career over something that probably won't work anyway? That evening, Culin sat alone in his crater workshop, officially forbidden from continuing his experiments. Around him lay the scattered pieces of confiscated prototypes and abandoned sketches. The bureaucratic machinery of the army had efficiently crushed his initiative in less than 24 hours, but from across the fields came the sound he'd been hearing for weeks. The distant rumble of Sherman tanks approaching another hedgerow, followed inevitably by the sharp crack of German anti-tank weapons and the dull explosions of burning fuel. The killing continued while proper channels processed proper procedures through proper authorities. 3 days after the official shutdown, Curtis Culin was working late in the motor pool when Private Danny Chen approached him quietly. Chen was a radio operator who'd been wounded in a hedgerow assault and was temporarily assigned to light duty. "Sergeant, I heard about your project getting shut down," Chen whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I wanted you to know my tank crew thinks your idea makes sense. We're the ones getting killed out there while the brass argues about proper channels." Chen wasn't alone. Over the next few days, word spread through the tank crews about the mechanic who'd been forbidden from trying to save their lives. The enlisted men understood something the officers didn't. Desperate times required desperate measures, and military protocol was a luxury they couldn't afford. Culin found himself approached by crews who quietly offered support. Tank Commander Sergeant Bill Thompson slipped him detailed measurements of Sherman armor specifications. Gunner Corporal Jake Mitchell provided intelligence about German anti-tank positions. Most importantly, several crews volunteered to test any device Culin could build, regardless of official approval. The breakthrough came when Culin realized he'd been thinking about the problem wrong. Instead of trying to build the perfect device on the first attempt, he needed to iterate rapidly with actual Sherman tanks. The scale models were useful for basic concepts, but the real physics could only be understood by testing with real 30-ton vehicles. Working in secret after midnight, Culin and a small group of volunteer mechanics began modifying an already damaged Sherman that was scheduled for salvage. The tank had taken a non-penetrating hit to the side armor and was officially awaiting repair parts, which made it perfect for unauthorized experimentation. Using Czech hedgehog steel and welding equipment borrowed all from the engineering depot, they fabricated 4 prongs according to Culin's refined calculations. The work had to be done quietly, without lights that might attract attention from patrols or German observers. The first full-scale test was conducted in a remote section of the American lines, far from headquarters and curious officers. Tank Commander Sergeant Thompson volunteered his crew to operate the modified Sherman. At dawn on June 25th, they approached a hedgerow that had stopped 3 previous assaults. Remember, Culin instructed through the radio, don't try to climb over, hit the base at full speed and let the prongs do the work. The modified Sherman accelerated toward the ancient earthen barrier. The steel prongs bit into the base of the hedgerow with tremendous force, and for a moment, it seemed like the tank might be stopped just like all the others. Then something extraordinary happened. The centuries-old root system, which had seemed impenetrable, began to give way. The prongs found weak points in the earthen structure and exploited them ruthlessly. With a grinding, tearing sound that could be heard across the battlefield, the Sherman pushed through the hedgerow without ever exposing its vulnerable belly armor. Jesus Christ!
It worked! Thompson's voice crackled audio. Oh, we're through! Oh, we're actually through! But the real test came 30 seconds later, when German machine gun fire erupted from the field. The Sherman crew found themselves in perfect position to return fire, with their frontal armor facing the enemy and their main gun. For the first time in weeks, an American tank had breached a hedgerow and survived the experience. In hours,
word of the successful test spread through the entire division. Tank crews who'd been facing certain death in hedgerow assaults suddenly had hope. But Culin knew the real battle was just beginning, convincing the army bureaucracy to approve a device that worked, regardless of who had invented it. By June 26th, news of the successful hedgerow breach had reached every level of command, creating chaos in the chain of authority. Tank crews were demanding immediate access to Culin's device. Officers were split between excitement about a potential breakthrough and fury over unauthorized field modifications. And German intelligence had noticed something unusual was happening in the American sector. Major Williams arrived at the motor pool in a fury. Sergeant Culin, you were explicitly ordered to cease unauthorized experimentation. Not only did you disobey direct orders, but you've compromised operational security by conducting unauthorized tests. But before Culin could respond, Colonel James Bradley from Division Headquarters intervened. Bradley had been receiving pressure from multiple sources. Tank commanders demanding the new device, casualty reports that were becoming politically unacceptable, and intelligence suggesting the Germans were planning a major counterattack within days. Major Williams, I understand your concerns about protocol, Bradley said carefully, but we have a bigger problem. General Patton is demanding immediate breakout from the bocage, and our current casualty rates make that impossible. If this device works, we need it deployed immediately. The pressure was intensifying from multiple directions. Ultra-intercepts suggested German reinforcements were moving toward Normandy. The weather was turning bad, threatening to ground Allied air support. Most critically, Stalin was demanding evidence that the Western Allies were serious about opening a second front, or he might consider a separate peace with Germany. Sir, Williams protested, deploying untested equipment violates every safety protocol. What if these modifications fail in combat? What if they cause more casualties than they prevent? Major, we've lost 18 tanks in 3 days trying to break through hedgerows using conventional methods. How much worse could this get? That afternoon, German artillery began targeting the section where Culin's test had occurred. Someone had reported unusual American activity, and the Germans were responding with increased vigilance. The window for surprise was closing rapidly, but the bureaucratic machinery was moving slowly while the tactical situation deteriorated. Army Ordnance wanted 6 weeks of testing. Division wanted deployment within 48 hours. Corps headquarters was demanding immediate results, while simultaneously requiring proper documentation. The crisis came to a head when Sergeant Thompson's crew, operating the modified Sherman, was called to support an emergency assault on a heavily defended hedgerow complex. German forces had been reinforcing their positions and were threatening to cut off an advanced American unit. "Sir, we need that modified tank now," Captain Morrison reported to Colonel Bradley. "We've got 2 companies pinned down, and conventional tanks can't get through to support them without being destroyed." Bradley made the decision that would determine whether Culin's innovation lived or died. But deploy the modified Sherman. If it works, we'll worry about paperwork later. If it fails, he didn't finish the sentence. As word spread that the Culin hedgerow device was being deployed in actual combat, dozens of officers and enlisted men gathered to watch. Some hoped for vindication of American ingenuity, others expected catastrophic failure that would end the experiment permanently. Culin stood among the observers, knowing that everything he'd worked for would be decided in the next few minutes. The modified Sherman was approaching a hedgerow complex that had stopped 2 previous assaults and cost 6 tank crews their lives. If his device failed now, it would be buried forever in military bureaucracy. If it succeeded, it might change the course of the entire Normandy campaign. The stakes couldn't be higher, and time had run out for everything except results. The modified Sherman approached the hedgerow complex at 15:47 hours on June 27, 1944. Sergeant Thompson's crew knew they were carrying more than 30 tons of steel and machinery. They were carrying the hopes of every tank crew in Normandy and the reputation of a mechanic from New Jersey who dared to think differently. German machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions as the Sherman closed distant. MG-42s chattered their deadly rhythm, but the rounds sparked harmlessly off the tank's frontal armor. This was exactly what Culin had calculated. The modified approach kept the strongest armor facing the enemy at all times. "Contact front," Thompson reported over the radio. "Multiple machine gun positions. Engaging now." The Sherman's 75mm gun spoke, sending high-explosive shells into suspected German positions. But the real test was still ahead, the hedgerow itself. This wasn't the partially damaged barrier they'd tested on earlier. This was a pristine medieval fortification, 12 feet high, centuries old, with root systems that had stopped every previous American assault. "Here we go," Thompson muttered to his crew. "Full speed ahead." The Sherman accelerated toward the ancient earthen wall. Culin's steel prongs, fabricated from German beach obstacles and welded with midnight precision, bit into the base of the hedgerow with tremendous force. For a heart-stopping moment, the tank seemed to hesitate as if it might be stopped like all the others. Then the physics that Culin had calculated in his bomb crater workshop took over. The prongs found the weak points where drainage and animal activity had compromised the root structure. Steel, driven by 30 tons of American manufacturing, began tearing through centuries of French agriculture. The sound was indescribable, a grinding, ripping roar, as if the earth itself was being torn apart. Ancient stones tumbled from the hedgerow's crown. Root systems that had survived Norman invasions and medieval wars finally surrendered to modern engineering. The Sherman burst through the hedgerow like it was made of paper, its frontal armor intact, its crew unharmed, its main gun ready for action. In the field beyond, German defenders who'd expected to ambush another climbing tank found themselves facing direct fire from an unexpected angle. "Breakthrough! Breakthrough!" Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. "Hey, we're through and engaging enemy positions. The device works perfectly." But the validation didn't stop there. Following behind Thompson's Sherman came 2 more modified tanks that Culin's team had secretly prepared. Each one smashed through adjacent sections of the hedgerow complex, creating multiple breach points and preventing German defenders from concentrating their fire. Within minutes, American infantry was pouring through the gaps, supported by tanks that could actually fight instead of burning. The pinned-down companies were relieved, German positions were overrun, and what had been an impending defeat became a decisive victory. Colonel Bradley, watching from an observation post, turned to Major Williams with grim satisfaction. "Major, I believe Sergeant Culin has just solved our hedgerow problem." The news spread through Allied command with lightning speed. General Omar Bradley immediately ordered mass production of the device. Within hours, welding crews were working around the clock to modify every available Sherman tank. The Culin hedgerow device, soon nicknamed the Rhino by tank crews, was being rushed into production without a single day of additional testing. By evening, German radio intercepts were reporting new American superweapons breaking through previously impregnable positions. But it wasn't a superweapon at all. It was simple, mechanical engineering applied to an ancient problem by a man who refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. Curtis Culin stood in his motor pool workshop, surrounded by officers who'd ignored him days earlier, watching his sketches being copied and distributed to armor units across Normandy. The crazy mechanic's idea was about to become standard equipment for the United States Army. Within 72 hours of the successful test, the transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. Welding crews worked in 3 shifts around the clock, modifying Sherman tanks with Culin's hedgerow device. The beaches of Normandy, once littered with German defensive obstacles, became salvage yards where Czech hedgehogs were systematically dismantled and repurposed into tank-mounted hedge cutters. The first major test came on June 30th when the 2nd Armoured Division launched Operation Cobra's preliminary phase. Instead of the grinding, bloody advance that had characterized the previous weeks, American tanks smashed through hedgerow after hedgerow with mechanical precision. What had taken days to accomplish now happened in hours. Major Williams, who'd confiscated Culin's prototypes just a week earlier, found himself personally overseeing the mass production of the device he'd once condemned. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, including Williams himself. "Sergeant Culin," Williams said quietly during one of his visits to the motor pool, "I owe you an apology."
"I was wrong to shut down your work, sir. You were following regulations. I understand that." "No, Sart. I was protecting my own reputation instead of supporting innovation. There's a difference, and it nearly cost us the breakthrough." The conversion of skeptics happened at every. Colonel Sykes, from Army Ordnance,
who'd dismissed Culin's work as amateur contraptions, now found himself writing urgent reports to Washington about the revolutionary field modification that was changing the nature of armored warfare. But the most dramatic conversion came from an unexpected source. General Erwin Rommel, commanding German defenses in Normandy, sent a coded message to Berlin that was intercepted by Ultra. American forces have deployed new technology that neutralizes hedgerow defenses. Previous tactics no longer effective. Recommend immediate tactical reorganization. Tank crews who'd faced certain death-approaching hedgerows were now volunteering for assault missions. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. American morale soared while German confidence plummeted. Sergeant Thompson, whose crew had conducted the decisive test, became something of a celebrity among armored units, but he consistently deflected credit back to Culin. "Is that mechanic from Jersey saved all our lives? We just drove the tank where he told us to drive it." The device's effectiveness exceeded even Culin's optimistic projections. Modified Shermans were breaking through multiple hedgerows in single missions, maintaining momentum that had been impossible with conventional tactics. German defenders, positioned to exploit predictable American climbing attempts, found themselves facing attacks from unexpected angles and directions. By July 4th, American forces had advanced more in 4 days than they had in the previous 4 weeks. The bocage, which had seemed like an impregnable fortress, was becoming a liability for German defenders who could no longer count on it for protection. But perhaps the most telling validation came from an unexpected source. Captain Heinrich Müller, commanding a German panzer company, was captured during one of the breakthrough operations. During interrogation, he made a comment that perfectly captured the impact of Culin's innovation. "Well, we spent months preparing these hedgerow defenses. Every position was calculated to stop American tanks climbing over the barriers, but nobody told us you had learned to go through them instead of over them. It's like preparing to fight cavalry and discovering your enemy has invented the airplane." General Patton, always quick to recognize tactical innovation, visited Culin personally to commend his work. "Sergeant, you've done more to advance this war in 1 week than some generals accomplish in a year. The army needs more mechanics who think like engineers and fewer engineers who think like bureaucrats." The transformation was complete. Curtis Culin, the crazy mechanic whose ideas had been dismissed as impossible amateur engineering, was now being consulted on tank modifications by the highest levels of Allied command. His simple solution to an ancient problem had become Hitler's worst nightmare, American ingenuity applied with devastating effectiveness. The Culin hedgerow device, officially designated the M1 dozer, but universally known as the Rhino, became standard equipment for American armor in Europe. By August 1944, over 60% of Sherman tanks in Normandy carried some version of Culin's innovation. The bocage that had threatened to bog down the Allied advance for months was neutralized by a mechanic's refusal to accept the impossible. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th, succeeded beyond all projections largely because American armor could finally move freely through Norman countryside. The breakthrough that began at St. Lo led directly to the liberation of Paris, the collapse of German defenses in western France, and ultimately the end of the war in Europe. But Curtis Culin never sought fame or recognition. After the war, he returned to Cranford, New Jersey, reopened his father's garage, and spent the rest of his life fixing cars and farm equipment. When reporters occasionally tracked him down for interviews about his wartime innovation, he consistently deflected credit to the tank crews who'd risked their lives testing his ideas. "I just solved a mechanical problem," he would say. "Other people did the fighting." The broader lesson of Culin's story extends far beyond World War II battlefield tactics. In 1944, a mechanic with no formal engineering education solved a problem that had stumped military academies, engineering corps, and general staff officers. His success came not from superior knowledge, but from different thinking, the willingness to question assumptions that others took for granted. Modern military doctrine still teaches the Culin principle, the importance of encouraging innovation from unexpected sources and the danger of institutional resistance to unconventional solutions. The Pentagon's current emphasis on rapid prototyping and field experimentation traces directly back to lessons learned from a New Jersey mechanic who refused to accept expert opinion about what was impossible. In today's world of technological disruption, Culin's story resonates beyond military applications. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs facing impossible challenges, medical researchers pursuing breakthrough treatments, and engineers tackling climate change all embody the same principle that guided a 29-year-old sergeant in a Norman bomb crater. Sometimes the craziest ideas are the only ones crazy enough to work. The hedgerows of Normandy still exist today, many unchanged since 1944. French farmers still use them to mark property boundaries and control livestock, but now they're also monuments to a different kind of courage, the willingness to think differently when conventional wisdom fails. Curtis Culin Jr. died in 1963, largely unknown outside his New Jersey community. But his legacy lives on every time someone looks at a neat impossible problem and asks not whether it can be solved, but how it can be solved differently. The crazy mechanic who rewired a tank and turned it into Hitler's worst nightmare proved that innovation doesn't require credentials. It requires curiosity, persistence, and the courage to challenge assumptions that everyone else accepts without question. In a world that still faces seemingly impossible challenges, Curtis Culin's story remains more relevant than ever. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs come not from the experts who know why something can't be done, but from the amateurs who don't know enough to quit trying. The hedgerow cutter that changed history reminds us that genius often wears coveralls and carries a wrench, and that the next great innovation might be sketched tonight in someone's garage by someone everyone thinks is crazy.